My name is Mildred Gertrude Heidi Singer. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in January 23rd, 1933. I was given that name because my mother thought it was a very pretty name because she was German and she thought it was very American. I have two sisters. Doris is 5 years younger, Judy is 13 years younger from her. We lived in Brooklyn and then we moved to the Hoffmans in Jamaica and lived there, and then we moved out to Valley Stream when I was 12 years old.
I'm here about 4 years old and I'm holding my hair because I kept on saying, meine Locken. The wind was blowing, and meine Locken means my hair, my curls, my curls. My mother used a hot iron. It was a curling iron that was warmed on a gas stove, and it often burned your hair, but I had curls.
Animal crackers in my soup, monkeys and
On the Christmas of 1938, Doris was almost 1 year old, and I received a Shirley Temple doll, full size with curls. I thought that was so wonderful because Shirley Temple was the star of the 30s in the movies.
Those animal crackers in my soup. When I get hold of the big bad wolf, I just push him under the ground.
I went to PS 30. It means public school number 30. And I would say I went there during the war years of 1941 to 45. And we had, I would explain, air raids. The air raids, we had we were color coded of where we should go when the air raid signal was sounded. And then we went under our desks in a certain area and waited until the clear signal came. And then we were usually sent home. And we were told to walk home, not in a big group, but only 2 people at a time, so that if there were any planes flying over, that they would not see a whole group of people. We also had collected scrap metal for the war effort. We had savings bonds, we had savings stamps that we saved for the war effort. We got 10 cents for each stamp.
We'll be coming down your way. Get your savings out when you hear him shout, any bonds today? Come on and get
We got a
folks.
booklet,
Come on,
and that's how we contributed to the war effort. And it was kind of real for us because the Nazi submarines landed on Long Island. We didn't know, like the Japanese came to California, the others came from the East Coast.
My name is Harald Eckhart Singer. The reason I think I was given that name is my father was a devout Nazi. Meister Eckhart was a monk that solidified the German language. He was the first Roman Catholic prelate that started preaching to the masses in German, and so he was elevated to be a patron saint of the Nazi movement. I was born in Dresden, Germany on the 29th of November, 1932. I was born into a family that was not necessarily approving of my father's marriage to my mother, and as such, we never got to know that side of the family. My mother was contacted by Mormon missionaries somewhere around 1913 to 14. And she became a baptized Mormon in 1914. That has become her life. the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She immigrated to the United States in 1925 because she wanted to gather with the saints in Salt Lake City. She was in the United States for over close to 7 years, you know. And my grandmother decided that inasmuch as the first child of my parents was a boy, the second one is to be a girl. It turned out to be a boy. And she ascribed that strange quirk of nature to the very fact of her damnable Mormonism that she belonged to. Subsequent to my being a boy, my mother had 2 daughters. So we were 2 boys and 2 daughters. Christmas presents from my grandmother always came for 3 people. I was a non-entity. And they never unpacked grandmother's or grandfather's presents that they sent to us until they rearranged it into 4 portions rather than 3. At any rate, it was a difficult beginning for my mother. She was never respected or liked by her mother-in-law. I was in a hospital for the first 6 weeks of my life. My parents were told, go home, he will die. My mother said, let me call the elders of the church and administer to him. Of course, he felt, since he's going to die anyway, so humor her. And they came, administered with him, and today, 83 years later, I'm still very much alive and healthy. And we lived in Spandau till I was about 10 years of age. Whenever we were finished with our homework, we disappeared in the forest and played there. In the winter time, it was beautiful as far as it was hilly, and we went with our sleigh and always went down those hills. My father, who had been drafted into the German army at the beginning of the Second World War, felt that it was time to move his children away from his mother, from our mother, and put us into a private school, a SS training school for individuals that eventually would then gradually move into the SS army. While in that school, we received training at a regular high school. And then, of course, in the afternoons, we were given all kinds of political indoctrination. And I sat right next to an individual whose father was a farmer. And he told me that if you take one of the things that fight weeds and mix it with charcoal, it becomes gunpowder. So I went downtown and bought myself 2 pounds of that stuff. I mentioned to the group leader that we had in that room, there were about 15 that studied, and I told them what wonderful powder I had. So we got a gallon bucket and put about a pound of that white powder. I don't know what it was. They called it Unkraut X. And after we had mixed it up and dissolved it, so each one of the boys in the room produced one of those sheets of blotter papers, and we immersed that in the gallon bucket. They had heating bodies that were about 2.5 feet off the ground, going up to almost 6 feet, which then heated the rooms. So we take the blotter paper and we draped it over the heating bodies. All of a sudden, the leader of the group says, I don't think that thing works, you know. He took a match and lit up one corner, and a flame shot all the way up to the ceiling, raced about 30 feet down the roof, leaving big black marks on the ceiling. And the teachers came in, and they gave us a lecture, and they threatened us within an inch of our life. If we ever do that again, we'd really be in deep Dutch. So after the teachers had left, the leader of our group said, let's do this again. We soaked the blotter paper in the water, hung it up on the heating bodies. This time we didn't put a match to it. After we got that paper real dry, we got a piece of hard paper and made a rocket about 1.5 feet long. And then made a point that put it on top of it. And then we really stomped this thing full of that blotter paper. We lit the tail. And it was a rocket that flew off and zigzagged all over the room and created the same problem we had before. We created the first solid fuel rocket. The teacher said, would the guilty party that constructed this last night please come forward and acknowledge their crime? I had permission from the group as well as the group leader. He sat behind me and he whispered into my ear, Singer, if you get up, I follow right after you. And I said to him, you get up first and I follow you. He didn't get up. Nobody acknowledged it. They took us out and marched us up and down a football field for an hour and a half, and it was raining and we were wet. And then they brought us back into the place where we lived, and they said, we will be dressed in parade uniform in 5 minutes. Of course, we went to our closets, got parade uniform, got in there, got out there, and stayed there for about 10 minutes while we were lectured, and it rained some more, and he says, dismissed in 5 minutes. We want you in bed. We rushed up, we took our stuff and threw it in the closet, you know, got our sleeping clothes on, got into bed. After we were in bed for 5 minutes, they said, we want you in 5 minutes and have closet inspection. And of course, every individual in the group received the demerit. I didn't get any. Everyone's bed was default except mine. 2 nights later, about midnight, one half of the group that did not live in our particular thing came up, and 4 guys jumped me, turned me over, ripped my clothes off the back, and then 15 or 16 guys with sticks here beat the hell out of me. I personally think that was the day Nazism was beaten out of me. And just about 2 days before we were going back to the school, we received a telegram telling us not to come back. By the time we heard the Russian artillery shooting into the city, we figured it was time to leave that city. And we all got onto a train. And incidentally, which was the last train that went out of the city. And so we traveled for about an hour before we stopped dead. And the Russians had encircled that city and had closed the thing, and our train was stopped and we couldn't go any further. Then the Germans gave a counteroffensive and broke the encirclement, and that's when we were able to go ahead. We went then until we came to the river of Oder in the town of Krischin. But the thing is, the railroad tracks were bombed out for about 2.5, 3 miles prior to that. So we stopped there in the middle of the winter time at midnight with about 2 to 2.5 feet of snow on the ground, and we had to take all our possessions and move it those 3 miles to the place where there was a train waiting for us to go to. We got onto the train. 10 minutes later, the train took off to Berlin. And when we got to Berlin, there was a lady who came from Bavaria. And she said, we're leaving here in about 3 days to go to Bavaria. Want to go with us? My mother said, well, definitely. So we went to the railroad station where we would embark to go to Bavaria, and the town of Bavaria was Landshut, which is a little town outside of Munich, about 45 kilometers. When we got to Landshut, we had to scrounge things together. We got our coupons for food, but we had no support of anything. The only thing that we had is the city or the government, and of course they didn't have much to give to anybody. My father was in the army. We don't know where he was. We hadn't heard from him for about 1.5 years by that time.
It's my grandparents' house that they owned, and they lived in until February 1945, when they, with all the children that lived there, 17 of my relatives, which I never met, were killed that night in a bombing attack of the Allies.
My mother had a dream, and she said the town is going to be bombed tomorrow. She told it to the woman that helped us to come from Berlin to Bavaria, and she said, oh, Mrs. Singer, you just had a nightmare. He says, what is there in this town that they would want to bomb? The next day, it was early March. My brother and I, we were outside, the sky was blue, and all of a sudden, there came a squad of approximately 40 bombers and approached our city. And my brother and I, we looked at it, we put our hands up, and these planes were, from where we're standing, were that low, you know. All of a sudden, a rocket came out of the front plane, and then we heard a thundering waterfall. It was 12 noon. Explosions followed for 1.5 hours. We were bombed almost. It was unbelievable. The sky, which was blue and the sun was shining, turned into darkness. The black smoke billowed all the way up in the sky, and it was as if it was in the middle of the night. They came within 500 yards of our house, and then it stopped. The result of that bombing attack, American prisoners were brought in. Clean out the rubble that the American planes had created. The American prisoners finished 2 tracks through the rubble, and then, of course, 2 days later, my mother had a dream. We're going to get bombed. He says, what are they going to bomb now? They destroyed everything. My mother and all the other people went out into the countryside where there were all kinds of bushes that they could hide in. I stayed behind and I listened to the radio, and they say there is a squadron of 40 planes that is turning off in southeasterly direction. I knew immediately what the southeasterly direction were. I grabbed the bag and I wasn't gone a mile when the bombs started to fall. Bombing squads delivered their load. They took up and then flew back to wherever they originated from. Later on we were told, they were always told that they were not to come back with any ammunition. So they flew around everything that crept or crawled and shut up houses and cows and horses and buildings and surrounding until they had spent all the ammunition, and then they took off. In came the American prisoners to clear away the rubble. And after they had finished 2 tracks through the rubble, 2 days later, my mother had another dream. I didn't take any chances this time, so when they took off early in the morning, I went with them and waited for the Americans to come in. So when the Americans came in, they drove into the town. The number of trucks they were pushing through never ended, and we looked at that and said, now how were they able to fight these people with all these things which they had? We went home after the Americans had come in, and that is one thing that I cannot understand, is the Americans opened the town for plunder to all prisoners of war that were in there. And they were, of course, from Russia, Hungary, and all the Slavic countries, and all the businesses were destroyed and everything. Well, my brother and I, we just took our bags and we shoveled everything in there, whether it was dirty or not, we shoveled it in because it was food to us. Then we went home, dropped our bags on the kitchen table, and then we went back and got some more. Well, the Americans set up a camp right across the street from us. One day we were again in that outfit with the Americans, and they told us to get out. Raus, raus, they said to us. So my brother and we went home to say to our mother, well, they kicked us out, we can't get anything. So when we got there, she said, I got something for you. She went in their papers. That's one thing she always kept. And she dug out my brother's birth certificate. He was born in Brooklyn, New York. We went to the camp the next day, and they say, raus, raus. And we showed them the birth certificate. They were flabbergasted to see a kid that was born in Brooklyn, New York, come into their camp. We were the only 2 guys that were allowed in it. My brother spoke a little English. I spoke very broken, since I only had it about 9 months, you know. But he had thing, and we were able to tell them what we needed, you know, and somehow they conveyed to us whether my mother would wash some clothes for them. They gave us soap, and so we took the clothes home, washed the soap, took it back. We got cigarettes and coffee and payment, and we used those things to trade with farmers and got ourselves eggs and butter. My brother became an American. He declared to be American citizen, and so therefore he received food packages from the relief organizations from over there, which was a godsend to us. One day the next door neighbor who knew my father came to the back door window and says, Mrs. Singer, your husband is coming. And our chin dropped to the floor. why didn't he get killed in the war? You see, in 43, he had said to my mother, I'll divorce you. If he had gotten killed, she would have gotten a pension after the German government would have reestablished itself. But there he was, came back. Anyway, he gave permission to my son to immigrate to the United States because he felt that once he gets to the United States, he can provide us with food materials and packets and things like that. He was in America, and then there was just 4 of us, my mother, my 2 sisters, and I. In 1947, after my father finally had left us because he was no longer very happy with us as a family, we heard over the radio the announcement that the immigration quota for Germany was being opened in 1947. The minute my mother heard that, she went to Munich by train and registered our names to immigrate to the United States. It was a enjoyable ride. It was not stormy, it was smooth, and we had a lot of opportunities to have fun. And then, of course, when we got to New York, we were greeted. It was in the evening. My brother was there, and my aunt and uncle was there, and they took us to their home. We bought Krug bread that was delivered, and the guy was utterly overwhelmed how much bread we ate, you know, coming from Germany and so on. And he mentioned it to another individual at the at the company, which happened to be a man by name Gus Heider.
My father worked for Krug's. He was a delivery man for bread and pastries, and then they added milk to the route. He delivered from door to door and collected, and it was just like I guess like a milkman's job.
And we met his 3 children, and he met the wife, you know, and got acquainted, and I met, incidentally, it's the first time I met my wife. I thought she was a very nice looking woman, you know, but then of course they were all dolled up with rouge and lipstick and so on, something that we didn't see and had while we were in Germany. When we separated from class, from Sunday school into class, I asked my brother, what are these older women doing in our class? He looked at me, big smile came across his face. He says, these older women are younger than you are. It turned out to be my wife is too much younger than I am. We borrowed approximately a little over $1,000 for our fare from Germany into America. It took us a year to repay it. We all worked and we all put the money in the kitty, and we paid off the $1,000. Then, of course, they decided to go to Salt Lake City.
In 1950, we came west. We drove west in a car, the 3 of us, and came to Utah and to check things out, to go to school, because I wanted to go to BYU. And we drove home and came back the next year and dropped me off to go to college at BYU. When my family was here, my mother felt so much better. She had suffered all these many years with, she called hay fever. She was allergic to ragweed, just to the degree that she had asthma and could not breathe. And when she came to Utah, it was non-existent. And in April of '52, they moved to Utah. And then I was going to school at Brigham Young, and then they didn't have a nursing program, so I transferred to the University of Utah, and then at the LDS Hospital, which was then called LDS Hospital, up on the avenues, and lived there at the nursing home and graduated as a nurse from the University of Utah and the LDS Hospital in 1955.
Anyway, I was drafted in the Army. Went to the draft board in Salt Lake City, and they transferred me to Fort Douglas. Fort Douglas came, we went up there, and we had an old female sergeant that gave us instructions. She had a very ravaged voice from smoking. And so after she got through with all the instructions, she said to us, "Are there any questions?" I raised my hand, and she says, "What's the question?" And so I said, "You know, I'm not a citizen of the United States. I am still a national of Germany. Why am I being drafted?" And she answered, "You damn foreigners. You come to this country to partake of the good things in this life, and you don't want to fight. Get back into line or get back over there." I had my acquaintance with the United States Army. We received our orders, and my orders, I was going to be sent to Germany. I said, "Can you send me to Munich?" He says, "I'll send you to Augsburg, which is the closest to Munich that I can send you." However, when we arrived in Bremerhaven, and a lieutenant walked by, he says, "Anyone here speak German?" I says, "I do." He says, "Come in with me and translate for me." So we went to talk to the conductor, and I translated it to the lieutenant, and then of course I translated what he said to me to the German. He says, "You know," he says, "your German is rather excellent. If it weren't for your American accent, one could almost think that you are a native of Germany." Well, we had nothing to do really, you know, we just loafed around. In other words, I just filled up my time to go home. And when I got back to Salt Lake, there was nobody to greet me. I went home. I had to sit in front of the door. My mother was working, and I waited for about 4 hours before I could get into the house. You see, in the Army, I associated primarily with returned missionary soldiers. I said, you know, I want to go on a mission. My mother worked all day, and I was itchy. And so I went to the bishop. He interviewed me. I said, "Can I make a request as to where I can go?" He says, "Oh, sure, you can." I says, "Where do you want to go?" "I like to go to Great Britain." "And what do you want to, why Great Britain?" He says, "Well, I like to just to learn better English than what I speak now." Then I came to the stake president. His name was Murdoch. He became Murdoch Travel in Salt Lake City. And he said, "You know, if you want to go to Great Britain, it's rainy, it's damp. By the time you leave there, you have web between your toes." He says, "If I'd have my druthers, I'd go to Australia. The sun always shines, and there's just a wonderful climate." So Australia I went. I was assigned to Queensland. It was one mission at the time, About a month after I got there, they cut it into 2 missions. And I spent most of my time up in Brisbane. Christmas time came around. I didn't have much money, so I invested only about $30 worth in Christmas cards and sent it to all the friends that my mother knew. And I sent a Christmas card to Mrs. Gertrude Heidi. Her daughter, Mildred Heidi, was called on a mission to Germany.
1958, we were living on Imperial Street in Salt Lake City. As I was sitting on the podium in church, the bishop walked down the aisle, and as he was walking down the aisle, I knew he was going to call me on a mission, and sure enough, he did. I didn't have an MTC then. It was just on Main Street. There was a building where we spent 1 week, went to the temple, got on the train the following week, went to Chicago, and then on the train again to New York, went to the docks and got on a ship, the USS America, and spent 5 days on the water. The trip was uneventful. Went to Bremerhaven, mission president met us. We went to a fine dining place to eat, and then he gave me the name of my companion and put me on the train alone, and I was supposed to go to Rendsburg, Schleswig-Holstein, Germany, and I was petrified. When we got over the bridge, I thought I was sure I'd gone too far. When the train stopped and it said Rendsburg, opened the door, my mission companion was standing there, and the tears just flowed down my eyes that I had reached the place I was supposed to reach.
So I got a letter from Sister Mildred Heidi. I wrote back, and it was the first letter that she received after she arrived in Germany. We corresponded, you know, and so on and so forth, and one thing to another, and I made up my mind, I'm going to marry that gal.
On my mission, we lived in West Berlin, but we had business in East Berlin, like going to the opera and shopping over there because it was cheaper. So we had to go through the Brandenburger Tor, which was called then Checkpoint Charlie. And being in the mission home, we went in a car that had military plates on it. So we were supposed to be able to go through without any problems from the German police, which was East German police. They were called Fopos. But they were young boys, 18, 19 years old. And so they stopped us, even though we had a military plate on our car, and checked us. Where are you going? Where are you going? What are you doing there? And what do you have in the back? Well, we had in the back all the church translations of manuals, church manuals, Sunday school manuals, primary manuals, which we weren't supposed to bring over, but it was covered. And we had clothes in the back, clothes to give to some of our relatives. And we went over.
In those days, you had the choice of going second class boat to United States, or take third class, go around the long way. And so we went, so I chose the long way around because I wanted to visit somebody over there. Went to Zollikofen, Switzerland. I guess I went to one temple session there. Then from there I went to Munich, visit some of the friends that I had left there. Then I took a ride from there to Frankfurt. From Frankfurt I took a flight into Berlin. I didn't want to drive with my passport, which says I was born in Germany, and be stopped by the Russians. I was writing to her, you know, and I knew their address. About 7:30 in the morning. I was in front of her doorsteps, and I said, I wish to talk to Miss Heidi. Mildred came to the door, opened the door. She looked at me and says, what can I do for you in German, you know? And I didn't say anything. I just kept looking. Then she recognized me. She says, ah! And slammed the door. She said, we can't meet, but however, if you were at 5 o'clock at this one railroad station, we could talk together, you know. And so we did meet at 5 o'clock. We talked, you know, and the next day, of course, I flew out again. And then I went to Tempelhof. Guess who was there? The two missionary ladies. And she came to say goodbye. See, I came home in May of the year. By December, I proposed to her.
I accepted, reluctantly at first. I just wasn't sure. And, you know, I was on my mission, and he was, I didn't know him that well, and I thought, but he was cute, and he was nice, you know, and actually my family knew him because he came over and lived in the same ward that we did in New York. And then he came to Utah, and then we came to Utah. So we met again in Utah. And our families were friends, good friends. Came home, and 3 months after I came home, I got married.
We set a date, and it was September the 10th. 1958, that's when we got married.
We got married in the Salt Lake Temple, yes. Beautiful. My parents were there, his mother, and my sister. She had married earlier. My mother got a little bit annoyed because my ring didn't fit and was quite loose. And so Harold said, let's get it sized right away. So they all went to eat at the restaurant, and he wanted to go right now and get that ring sized. And so he went to the jeweler, and my mother was sitting there, and she said, where are they? God was high strung, and she was very annoyed. But anyway, it was a good time. We went on a honeymoon then to the parks down in Bryce Canyon.
My father-in-law refused to pay for the wedding pictures. So I had to pay it. I couldn't make a fuss, so I paid for it. But that was the money we were going on a honeymoon with. That was gone.
So he paid all his honeymoon money. He had to pay for the pictures. And so, anyway, it was lovely. We spent $68. Can you imagine that? For 3 days we had. That's all it took, $68, and went to all the parks. It was wonderful. Then we came home. He was going to school at BYU, and I worked at the health center at BYU.
I had to decide on a major. So I took a coin and I flipped it. And I say, tails, history, accounting, heads. Came up heads.
And then we packed up and went to Indiana for Harold's master's degree. And I worked at the hospital in Bloomington, Indiana, an old hospital. And I got pregnant there. And when I was in the delivery room, that baby was breech. And they were worried, I will say they were worried, because the week before a breech baby had died, or the mother had died, or the mother of the baby had died. And so they got a doctor to give me the anesthetic. I got the anesthetic ether because I was a nurse working there, and they didn't want anything to happen to me because I was working there. So I guess I was important. And anyway, John was born, and he was lovely. And he was a beautiful baby, actually, a very beautiful. He looked like his dad. He had big brown eyes. And then 10 days later, we packed up and moved to Denver, Colorado. After we'd been in Denver a year and lived a year, Harold decided to go get his doctorate degree. And we applied at 2 places. And finally, Washington let us know that he had been accepted and he had a teaching assistant job.
We left Denver in the evening. We loaded our trailer with all our belongings and we packed it wrong.
I was 8 months pregnant, I guess, with the second child at that time.
Trailer jackknifed on us.
And everything flew over the freeway, but good people in the freeway stopped and said, get everything off the freeway as quickly as you can. And so then good people from Denver Bishopric came by, the ward came by, took us in, and they right away got someone who was a mover in their family, and he said, oh, you didn't pack this correctly. The washing machine should be in the back, not in the tail end, not in the front of the U-Haul.
We went to Seattle, and we went very close to the university, went into a motel there, and when they saw us coming in there, they wondered whether they wanted to even rental to us.
Because we looked bedraggled, really bedraggled, and they looked at us and said, no room at the inn, no room at the inn. And yes, because I was so pregnant.
They gave me a teaching job to teach beginning accounting.
We moved into Sandpoint. Sandpoint was an old naval station, barracks kind of thing. Then I went and had some tests at the University of Washington in order to have the baby. And James was born. James was my second, and it was only 15 months apart. They were only 15 months apart. After not having been able to have any children for 3 years, here I have 2.
Money became very burdensome to us. Not that we had so much, it's the absence of it. I was able to sustain myself there for a year and a half. Eventually ended up at Rick's College, which was at that time a 2-year institution.
We moved then to Idaho, to Rexburg. The thesis we were going to do while he was working. And while in Rexburg, he was teaching at Rexburg. We lived in a little old house across the street from the college, but it was a good experience. And then I also had my third child. Jeff was born at the Madison County Hospital. I also worked there. I did work in Rexburg. In between, I taught in the nursing program. I taught the nurses.
So, but when we came to Rick's College, we found out that the Rick's College was a bureaucracy as well, except it was a more difficult bureaucracy. So after 3 years at Rick's College, I went back to the University of Washington back and picked up my situation again.
Then we packed up again, and Harold wanted to finish his doctorate degree, and he went to Cheney. Eastern Washington State University, and lived in another old house with all our belongings packed. Had the birthday parties there with just a couple of just one pan and a dish, one dish. Everybody had one dish, one pan, one glass. That's all we had unpacked. I was pregnant again and had Jennifer in Spokane. She was born in Spokane because it was near Cheney, and traveled with a week-old baby to Seattle. We got to Seattle. I was so tired I cried the whole time, but we found a house on Green Lake. And John went to school there, the first grade. Went to the first grade at school, Fairview, and had to walk a mile to school. Walked by himself, his first grade. Didn't think anything of it, just took him the first time and said, all right, you know which way to go. We found out then that he was colorblind, because he never knew which way to cross the street. He couldn't tell red and green, and he was colorblind. Julie was born in 1968 in Seattle. So then we have now 5 children, and when Julie was 4 months old, we moved to Logan, Utah.
Then went to Utah State, working full-time there as an assistant professor in finance and accounting. And I tried to write a dissertation. I was not very successful at that. I finally hired 2 English professors, and they started writing that thing for me after I have written it, and of course got the comments back from the professor in Seattle. I was getting close to 40.
Our family was expanding. Johanna was born in 1969.
And one day, the sheriff came by our house and pinned a notice on there that on the 29th of November of that month, they would sell the house on the steps of the county courthouse. And here was with a wife that was high pregnant, and she had a birth on the 6th of November. And I think it was a Down syndrome baby. It had no connecting link between the stomachs and the intestines. So on the sworn on the 6th of November, on the 13th we took her home. On the 19th of November she died.
Harold had lost his job at that time. I didn't have a job at the time, and we didn't know what to do, where to move. We got a loan from his brother-in-law, and we found a house. Or we were able to buy that house. We were able to buy the Logan house. When we moved into the house in Hyde Park, we had just been there 3 weeks. And John, Harold's brother, was killed.
When I came home from a mission, my brother was very much estranged from the family. He was very well inclined toward my uncle, even though my uncle was a total crook in my opinion. You know, when my brother was drafted in the army, he owed money on his truck, he owed money on his supply house, and he owed tithing. He always sent all of this money back. The man kept it for himself. He didn't give the money to the bishop, he didn't give it to the supply house, or paid off the truck. So that's why my brother distanced themselves from that side of the family. And I did his tax return, and then we started talking religion, you know, and some of the religious things that they believed in, you know, was not what you might call having the good housekeeping seal of approval on it. And eventually, they excommunicated my uncle, and then of course they went after my brother. They excommunicated him also, but they said we were going to have a meeting in which we're going to test, see what kind of belief you have. I says, why don't you tell him the truth? You're here to excommunicate him, and this is a foregone conclusion. 8 months after we were accused, the bishop called me in. And he said, we have a request by Elder Peterson to excommunicate you. I said, on one charge. He says, we haven't quite found that yet, but we'll find that yet.
Oh, I was quite and shook up. I shouldn't use the word shook up, but I was quite disturbed, and I prayed that it wouldn't happen. But then Harold went and he said it's going to happen. He was quite sure that it was.
We have 4 questions for you, and that's all we're going to ask you. First question: do you support the president of the church as a seer, etc., and etc.? We grew up in Germany. Hitler became our God. Everything he did was the most wonderful thing for the German people. And somehow it sunk into our psyche that we will believe people if they prove to us what they say they are and have our benefit. And so I gave an explanation to that.
And came back, and he said, I said, well, when he came back from the court, I said, were you excommunicated? And he said, I think so. I don't know. He said, I think so, but he said, it isn't certain yet.
With my brother, they gave them the message 5 minutes after they retired. Mine took 3 weeks. Sunday, 2 women on separate 2 occasions, wives of high councilmen, came to my wife and told her, he says, they didn't all agree on excommunicating your husband. And they sent it to Salt Lake, to Peterson. And Peterson sent back, make it unanimous, he wrote back, or we change the high council. And then I received my answer.
And then people were saying that we should, are you going to divorce him now that he's not a member anymore? And I thought, no, why would I do that? And leaving me with all my children, because then our children are sealed to us, and it's going to stay that way. And it wasn't because of moral reasons, it was doctrinal. He was a good husband, good father, good provider. He was still Harold, so that's why we stayed. Loved him and loved him.
Someone whispered into my ear and said, what did you learn in school? What did you prepare for? He says, I answered, I said, accountant. Why don't you do that? And there was in the mail an advertisement for business cards. I ordered 1,000, and 1,000 I passed out within 6 months. That's when my professional life as a private accountant started.
And we lived at Hillcrest from 1969 to 1979, 10 years. And then in 1977, we had Jessica. And so we only had 7 children, and the house we were living in was a rental. We needed more room. So that's why we went out to Hyde Park. We had some friends, the Hubers were living in Hyde Park, and they said, the Thurgoods are building a house, but they have to move, and they want to sell it. It's not quite finished, but it's big. So we went to look at it, and it was a big house. And so really quite quickly, we sold our house, and we were able to buy the house with only a little bit of a small mortgage out in Hyde Park. As I said, he's a rock to me, and loving always. And it isn't a day that doesn't go by that he doesn't say he loves me. And how pretty I am. He has pictures of me when I was young hanging up. I thought, oh, okay.
I asked her later on in life, what was your first impression of me? And she says, too short. I was about 10 inches shorter than she was.
It's been good, you know, when you're retiring, that you have enough money in retirement, that you don't have to worry about. He's been a good provider, very good. In the future, investing in his money, investing it wisely. That's another thing. If he says we put it there, we put it there, because he seemed to know. He knew. Because he was an accountant, but still, he knew. He's very frugal. Harold's frugal. I wouldn't say cheap, no, frugal.
My one son told me that if you had not been excommunicated, your 3 sons would not be members today. Because I would have been a very rigid individual. You go to priesthood meeting, you go to Sunday school, you do this and this and this and this. I never done any of this to my children. So they all became good latter-day Saints that went all on missions.
And he's been very, very supportive of the children going on missions. John went on mission to St. Louis. James went to Sacramento. Jeff went to Sweden. Jennifer went to Germany. It's back to the same mission I went to. She went to Germany. And Julie went to the Dominican Republic on a mission.
When I was 14 years old in Munich, Germany, at a stake conference, the mission president, he called young people out of the audience and bear testimony to the stake that was in session there in a meeting. And I was the very first one they called out and picked up. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know very much about the religion, but I said that I knew that Joseph Smith was the prophet of God. And after I sat down, I said to myself, do you really know that? I spent the rest of my life till now to find out who Joseph Smith was. And I have the most profound admiration for the man and for what he did for the salvation of mankind. And I don't believe that I am going to be excommunicated from the celestial kingdom because of my excommunication, only by my other actions that were not up to par.